First of all, thank you very much for organizing this amazing conference and for having me in one of my favorite cities in Dublin, even if it is only virtually and online. I'm still happy to be here. When I wrote the abstract for this conference, I must have been very optimistic because when I started preparing my presentation, I noticed that it was a bit too much, and maybe, as Rafaela just mentioned, it could have been a subject for a whole conference, because great translation is something I thought it would be more concrete, but when I started looking into it, it became more and more huge. So first, a bit of theory, and I have to mention first that I came across the idea, the concept of great translations through my retranslation research, which is the main focus of my research. And to answer to Duncan, I do use regularly the concept of retranslation studies. So why don't we start talking about literary translation studies as well? And the starting point, I go back 30 years to Antoine Berman, who wrote on great translations and who saw the concept as, he sees the concept of translation, literary translation, as a process of history as progress. So it's moving on towards an always better and better version. Every new translation enhances the previous one. And in the end, it should lead or leads to a canonical great translation. He formulated a number of those ideas in the very first special volume that was published on retranslation in 1990, Palimpsestes, on Retranslation. It was in French, with two very interesting seminal papers on retranslation. And in his introductory article, Antoine Berman had three concepts. Two of them are very much studied already. The first one is the idea about literary translations that age, or allegedly age, while the original always stays fresh and the best version. There has been a lot of research on this, and I will not go into that concept here. Another one was the retranslation hypothesis, as it was called later, and he claimed that a first translation is always quite domesticating, which is why a retranslation always has to go back to the original, closer to the original, so be more foreignizing. It has been studied as well a lot of times, and it isn't completely valid, but it is valid in a lot of cases. But the third idea he mentioned in his article was that of the great translations, or grande traductions. Which, yes, go on to exist and to be read and to be published and sold for a very long time. And instead of every generation having his or her personal translation of some canonical work. It might be difficult, and you might think it is quite subjective to name a list of great translations. Well, Antoine Berman had his own lists, and I will not read them for you, but you can you see them on the screen. This is his list of so-called great translations and his characteristics. So according to Berman, The characteristics of a great translation are that it is, first of all, a translational event in the target culture or target language. This is quite subjective. How can you judge a translational event? The second characteristic is even more vague to me. It is a translation with an extreme systematicity equal to the original. Okay. A meeting place between the source language and the target language. Yes, of course, but that's again subjective. When there is a strong link with the original and it has an impact on the target culture, well, this can be proven sometimes that you see an impact on the target culture. It is an unmissable precedent for future translators, so you cannot ignore that the translation exists. And very interesting, he also mentioned, it was of course a volume on retranslation, that a great translation has always to be a retranslation, which is quite curious. Of course, there is a link to the canonical works, and it's, well, a bit of a mystery, because on the one hand, the more canonical an author becomes, the more translators he or she will attract, and the bigger is the chance that a great translation finally appears. That seems logical. But Gambier in 1994 wrote that a great translation should also be foreignizing, according to the retranslation hypothesis. So only a translation that stresses the strangeness of the translation, that goes back to the original, that is foreignizing, can be, according to Gambier, a great translation. And then I asked myself the question, can retranslators only produce a great translation if they foreignize, if they refrain from modernizing the language, if they stay very close to the original? Is this the only possibility of creating a great translation? And I always refer to one curious case I came across. It's about the Polish translations of Winnie the Pooh. There's an article on those translations by Wozniak in 2014, stating that the very first translation of Winnie the Pooh was, the name was translated as Kubuś Puchatek. And then only 50 years later, there was a retranslator who tried to do it better, who made a more foreignizing, a more closer, faithful translation to the original. Had the reason to rename Winnie the Pooh as Fredzia Fifi, but there started a complete polemic in Polish literary system, and even the great science fiction writer Stanisław Lem criticized the new translation because it was too defamiliarizing. And he stated that, well, the audience already knew Kubuś Puchatek, was so familiar with the concept, the name, that they tend to prefer the older translation, even if the newer translation might be more faithful, more correct, closer, and so on. And this is curious, and I noticed something similar because my main research is on Russian translation, that for Russian poetry translations, you have the same idea. So, for instance, Shakespeare was translated into Russian by Pasternak, the famous Nobel Prize winner. And those translations are very Pasternakish. So they're not so close to Shakespeare, but still the majority of the audience in Russia prefers his translations to new translations, which are much more faithful and correct than those ones. So what is a great translation? It's not necessarily a translation that is very close or faithful to the original. And then a last point in my theoretical introduction is that we also have to think about retranslation as a not so well-determined fact and process, because where's the border between reprinting? Okay, that's correct, that's not so difficult. Revising, adapting, retranslating. Sometimes it's very difficult to classify a text as a revised version or a retranslated version. From which point on do we have a new translation and competing alternative translation? And I started, I wanted to study the great translation, that concept, by taking a case study from Dutch translation into Russian translation into Dutch. And I asked myself a few questions. How can we recognize a great translation? Is it always a retranslation? And what are the characteristics that can be just pointed out? Are great translations challenged more easily, more quickly, or the other way around? They are so good that people shy away from challenging those great translations. If we look at those translations, famous translations, do we see motives for retranslation mentioned in the paratext? Do we see similar processes in other cultures? And here again, I was very optimistic. And in my abstract, I promised to look at English, French, German, but English is enough. And I also promised to look at machine translation, but Antonio told us so much this morning. I will only have one slide with a few examples I took. Great translations, this is more or less a marketing tool, I think, because it is really used in a lot of cultures. When I wrote my abstract, I wasn't aware that there would be this year a book on translating great Russian literature by Kathy McAteer, published earlier this year, on Penguin's Russian classics. So the marketing of English translations of Russian literature, as this is the list, these are the Russian classics you all should read, and these are great translations. Something similar exists indeed in my own culture, because the publishing house Van Oorschot in Amsterdam has since the 50s a series of books. They are all published in a very luxury version, and very similar, as you can see here on the right, which is called the Russische Bibliothek, the Russian library, indicating that these are the works you all should know. And to go into the book by McAteer only shortly, it is interesting to see how she describes that, how in the British culture as well, the idea of collecting those classics started in the 50s, so right after World War II, when there was a huge interest in Russia and Russian in the West. And it was meant to collect, English translations, the legacy of which reputation resonates right up to the present day. Something similar in Dutch culture. The Russian library was also started in the 50s, 1953, and they were also eager to present it as a luxury series of translations. They invited very well-known translators at that moment to translate, and they kept it quite closed as a system of only 19th century Russian literature. Only in 93, they started to add a number of 20th century authors as well, and as a matter of fact, 50 years after the starting up of the series, they decided to make a systematic series of retranslations as well. So as a case study, I selected 2 literary works. I will see, I probably will have time only for the first one here. And when I read my Dutch language excellent journal on translating filter, the very last issue was on favorite translations, on great translations. And there I found, which I expected, but it was confirmed, that the Master and Margarita, a literary work by Bulgakov, is considered to be a great translation. And here I have to contradict Berman, because there isn't really a retranslation. There is only one translator of the Master and Margarita, and despite this fact that it was the very first translation, it has been reprinted many times. It has been reworked. Again, it's not a retranslation by the same author, Marco Fonse, and I. Prince, and it has been reprinted up to last year. But there is only one great translation still so far, which makes me wonder why isn't anyone attracted to trying the same. It's a very canonical work. It's a cult book in Russia. Why wouldn't anyone else retranslate this? Marco Fonse and I. Prince had mentioned in their paratexts that Marco Fonse was not satisfied with the first translation, that it was made under very huge time pressure, but that the publishers did not agree to a retranslation until recently in the 90s. So he has a co-retranslator now, who is a Bulgakov translator, by the way, and now it should be a completely new book, the most reliable translation, and so on and so on. Antoine, you mentioned already, and then this is only my one slide on machine translation, but I tried to compare the 1968 version with the 1997 version. And I also included MateCat as a machine translation tool to look at what would a machine translation system do with the Russian. These are only 3 examples, because there were a number of very good translations. Short sentences are translated quite good by a machine translation system, and other things are done very badly. But here it brought me to the idea that indeed it could help us sometimes. So if you see that malinovo is used in Russian, it means raspberry. And it was the first time translated as a strawberry nose. And now it's in the last version, it's only just a red nose. I wonder why not look at the machine translation, who made it a crimson red nose. It's quite interesting. And you can also see that sometimes you can forget about a word. Serebrene was forgotten in the 68 version, but the machine translation made the same decision as the last translators, so silver stars. And to compare with the same literary work in another culture, because it's always a question, is a translation, a great translation, idiosyncratic because of the one translator, or is it a book, a canonical book that attracts translators in a lot of cultures? I compared the Master and Margarita in English, and I was a bit astonished as a Dutch-speaking person, that it is possible that you can have at least 7 different translations which are still sold today. Well, perhaps Ginsburg and from 2004 is a bit old, but all the other translations are hardly 10 years old, and they are all reprinted, edited even the Glennie translation from 1967. And maybe this is the last element here, because I'm running out of time. To judge about a great translation, who will do the judgment? Well, fortunately, we have a lot of fora on the internet, and on Goodreads, you can find this kind of discussions where people actually compare different translations. So normally we read one translation of a literary work and that's it, but some people do compare several translations and give an overview of their ideas, how they judge Ginsberg's 76 translation, Pevere's translation, Burgin, Carpelson. The interesting thing, I will not let this to read you, but it's interesting how he judges the 67 version by Glennie. Oh, Michael Glennie. And then at the end, he repeats in Glennie's version, let's not read the Glennie. So it's still reprinted, it's still in the shops, but the audience doesn't judge it as a great translation. I had a second case study as well, but I think I should skip this and go to a few concluding ideas. It's not really a conclusion, but a great translation, if it is indeed a quality label, what is it based on which qualities, and who is giving the label? Is it the audience? Is it a publishing house? Is it history? Is the fact that something is still published and reprinted several times? It clearly isn't necessarily a retranslation, as Antoine Berman claimed. It is reprinted several times. I think that is necessary by experienced translators, not necessarily, but I saw that in the most cases, those are experienced translators. It is in a prestigious series of selected literary works. Is it challenged many times? Well, I noticed that, yes, it is the case in the 21st century, and I refer to a quote by Isabel Colomba, who said that the 21st century is the age of retranslation. Perhaps it is indeed. And yes, machine translation and translation memory do help, can give you good ideas, but I don't think they will replace us as translators completely ever. So this was mainly it, and I will stop sharing now. Okay, thank you.
Hi, Piet. You touched me in my very Russian core because I also translate from Russian and analyze Russian literature and love Russian literature, but also questions about whether the new translation is always better than the old one. I wrote on it and I discussed on it because clearly sometimes you see that clearly the older translation is better. There is this, it is very complex question. Of course, I am not going to monopolize my situation as chairman or chairwoman of this panel, but I have to say that it is also connected to economy also. For example, because in Croatia, for example, you have many translation of Pushkin's fairy tale of the golden fish and fisherman. Why? Because it's part of school curriculum and everybody wants to earn some money. So there were some 19th century translations, but in the 50s, our great poet translated it. And for me, it is the best translation. It is retranslation in a way, but for me, it's not that important because Croatian language changed a lot since 19th century, and it would be really, it's not the problem of translation per se, it's the problem of language. but new translations that were made in the 90s are worse than the translation from the 50s. And and also I always tell to my students, you know, you should know after 5 years of studying Russian, if your friend asks you, as my friend asked me, am I going to buy this translation of Anna Karenina or this or that one, you should know you should know how to recommend. And not, it is not always connected to when the translation happened. So a great topic, and I'm looking forward maybe in some emails to continue conversation. Let me see if somebody else has something to say on it. Yeah, Una says, thank you for the fascinating talk. I was wondering what you make of Susan Sarajeva's claim that while the translation of poetry receives attention, there is a lack of critical writing on prose retranslation. Maybe.
Yeah, that's a nice question indeed, because there is a big difference between indeed retranslating theater, which is done all the time because a lot of theater stages those are constantly new translations. Then prose retranslation is a bit in the middle, and I noticed, but perhaps that's something for my own Dutch-speaking culture, that every new translation is presented very clearly, but it is marketing, of course, as this is a new translation and it is a better one. It was refreshed. The language is refreshed. Is a word that constantly comes back. But then poetry retranslation, as a matter of fact, I have one student who is writing a master thesis on poetry retranslation now, so I'm very curious to see the results of her investigation. But I think that is something different at all, because you almost have to be a poet to translate poetry, and then retranslating poetry is just, in my opinion, making something completely new. There are so many ways of translating poetry, more options, more possibilities than in translating prose, I think, that you are, I cannot say that you are completely free, but you can have a lot more liberties as a poetry translator. And then I may suppose that indeed retranslations of poetry are discussed very much harder and much more into details than prose retranslations.
I love it. I love it.
And then to come back to the economy, yes, indeed, a lot is on economy. I remember a talk a few years ago on the literary market for translations in Turkey, where you have the same. So the moment the list of books that was printed, that is for the school program, that people have to read for the school program, you had a lot of competing translations of the same literary work in the same year. So 3 Dostoevskys in the same year, that was crazy, yeah. Almost, yeah.